You. Okay. Whew.
Hello, I made it, Larry. Thank you. Rick Bolick.
Hey, I'm so sorry about that.
That's all right.
For some reason, I thought I sent an email out to everyone, but obviously I might have missed some people.
Okay.
I think everyone. Okay, people are still. Yeah, and I'm admitting people as I go here, so we'll get started in a little bit. Okay, admit. Oh yeah, and this is going to be an interesting Zoom. So I sent a whole bunch of wines out to everyone in California that didn't get the full bottles, and unfortunately, the shipping company has inadvertently misplaced an entire pallet of shipments. So there's a whole bunch of people that were supposed to be on this tasting that are not going to be on this tasting. So I'm actually going to be repeating this tasting next week for them. Yeah, was not my intention, but you know what? I don't mind speaking longer, so that's okay. So I'm just waiting for everyone to show up that's going to show up.
And I was going to compliment your shipping because we got ours like the next day, which was absolutely amazing.
Well, you are probably the only people in California that actually got the small bottles, because you ordered the large bottles and the small ones separately, and they were supposed to go together. And it was my mistake that did not happen. And then there are a couple of people on the call that actually picked up bottles in the tasting room. But other than that, every other shipment, I literally over the weekend, I put together about 50 kits to send off to people, and they were picked up Monday. And normally with the shipping company that I use, they send an email out to everyone that your shipment is on the way. And I started getting people saying, hey, where's our shipment on Tuesday? It says you never shipped it. And I got onto the system, and it showed that indeed, supposedly I never shipped the wines, but I know that they were picked up. I sometimes do make mistakes, but I don't forget that. They were picked up by the shipping company. They were put onto his truck. They were driven up. And what apparently happened, it took about, they're still determining it, because I still don't know where my wines are. But apparently they ended up on a pallet with a different shipping company. And yeah, I'm still dealing with them. It's been very frustrating. I don't mind. Every shipping company is going to have problems. And I think we went over this on my last Zoom that, I think every shipping company from October forward has had issues, period, because they've been overwhelmed. But it's a matter of how you deal with those issues. So in the case of someone like David Bucher, where my wines froze, luckily I had a chance to get him wines back to him. So he actually received bottles where the plastic caps on the top, the bottles themselves were fine. The plastic caps apparently broke because they froze.
Yep.
It's amazing what happens in sub 20-degree weather.
Yeah, kudos to you, Larry, though, for getting them back out.
Oh, well, I'm glad you got them. And here's the crazy thing. If I had shipped those expedited, they probably wouldn't have gotten there. My shipping company is telling me that expedited via FedEx and UPS is actually taking longer than ground these days because they're still playing catch up from 2 weeks ago.
Mhm.
So that's pretty crazy.
Don't feel bad. They're losing, aerospace parts and missile parts and things like that too. So
Well,
it's not just wine.
I don't feel bad, except that if occasionally I'll send a bunch of stuff out and 1 or 2 shipments will kind of go sideways. For 50 shipments to all show that they were lost, obviously you realize something is not quite right at that point. So yeah, so I think everyone is here that's going to be here. I'll continue to add people as we get going. So for those of you who have not done a Zoom with me, I'm Larry. I'm owner winemaker of Tercero. A little background, I've been making wine for about 20 years. Didn't start off making wine. Started off in other industries and eventually made my way to winemaking. I'm not a scientist by trade. Science scared the dickens out of me, but I've had to take all these science classes. So I went back to school at UC Davis, got my master's degree in viticulture and enology. So I understand the technical aspects of winemaking, but as we all know with everything in life, technical aspects only qualify to go so far. There's so much of winemaking that goes well beyond that. I like to say I've been making wine for 20 years and I still don't know what I'm doing, and I'm okay with that. Mother Nature deals me a different set of cards every year. And the fun thing is being able to deal with that and not try to control it, because you just can't control it. And I'm okay with that. So I'm excited about these wines. You guys are some of the first to be trying some of these wines. And that's one of the fun things about these Zooms to me, is it allows me to get products that are brand new or library wines out to people and for them to try them. It is always a little challenging thinking of which wines to send people, knowing that they're going to be taken from my large bottles into my small bottles and shipped cross country. In the winter, it's not as big a deal because we're dealing with cooler temperatures. In the summer, obviously, I'll be doing things differently, having to account for temperature shifts and et cetera like that. But for the time being now, the small bottles, from what I can ascertain from people that are doing my tastings, are holding wines pretty well, and I'm pretty happy about it. So we're going to go through 5 wines. So if you do have questions, certainly feel free to, you can raise your hand. I'm going to follow the chat as well. You can ask questions in the chat as we get going. Most of you should have received a piece of paper that had information. Some of you probably did not, because I think I inadvertently left out that sheet of paper. I'll send you a sheet of paper afterwards, and I do apologize. My sheet of paper really doesn't have much in there other than some basic information about each of the wines, which we're going to be going over anyway. So we're going to start with my very first release of my Clairette Blanche. So Clairette Blanche is a variety that has been grown in the Rhone Valley in France. They've gone back as late as as early as the 16th century. And it's always been a pretty popular variety over there. It was not available in this country until Tablas Creek brought cuttings into this country in 2003. And when you bring grape varieties into this country, what generally happens is the cuttings have to go into quarantine through one of 3 or 4 different nurseries around the country. The main ones being Davis and outside of Cornell in New York. So the grapevines come in, they grow those grapevines up to make sure that the grapevines are disease-free. Because what can happen, if any of you in California travel to Oregon and come back, they generally like to stop you at the border, ask if you have produce, etc. Well, the reality is that certain bugs that are native to one part of our country are not native to another. And the last thing they want to see is transportation of these things. So they're worried about that. So the vines have to be put into quarantine, grown up in a controlled setting. It took 7 years for those vines to be released and able to be propagated. So in 2009, Tablas Creek started growing this variety, and it took until 2014 for them to release their first one. And pretty much everyone who is growing this variety has gotten the cuttings indirectly from Tablas Creek, because it wasn't available until then. It's an interesting variety. So Clairette Blanche it means clear white, which is kind of, it's a double statement, right? It's actually one of the only varieties that's feminine in nature instead of masculine. If it was masculine, it would be Claret Blanc, but because it's Blanche, it's feminine. It's the second most widely planted white variety in Châteauneuf-du-Pape. So it is well known, but in this country, not so much so. In fact, if you look at the California Grape Crush Report, which lists what grapes are grown every year, as of 2020, this variety has still not been broken out as its own variety. So it goes into other whites. So people are not, it's not that they're not, admitting that it's being grown, but it hasn't been categorized yet. I keep trying to admit somebody and it's not allowing me to. I'm going to deal with that later. Okay. So it is now grown throughout California, but the majority of it is grown between Santa Barbara County and Paso Robles in the quote unquote Central Coast area. So it came into Santa Barbara County about 3 years ago. This is the first time I've worked with the variety. And the reason I chose to want to work with this variety is it makes a very different wine than all the other whites that I work with. Most of my whites are known to have a lot of body, a lot of texture, a lot of richness. This is kind of the antithesis of that. I picked these grapes really early. In fact, much earlier than I thought, well, about a week earlier than anyone else I know, and probably earlier than I thought I was going to. They tasted great. I didn't really run sugar numbers on them. And when the sugar levels came back, the grapes didn't have as much sugar as I thought they were going to, and therefore I was worried they weren't going to have enough body, and it was going to be too light a white wine. I ended up fermenting this in older French oak barrels. So question that David asked is, what is older? So on the white side, these barrels were 6 to 15-year-old French oak barrels. And by fermenting in an oak, I hope to build a little bit more richness. And I think that happened in this case. And then after fermentation was done, I love the aromatics of this wine. It was a very slow fermentation. Sometimes white fermentations go quickly for whatever reason, the nutrients, etc. And this just kind of allowed it to go really slowly. And after fermentation was done, I took some of it and put it into stainless steel, and some of it I put into oak. It's the first time I'm working the variety, so I really wanted to have pieces to play with to try to understand it as best as possible. I bottled this February 8th. So I bottled this year earlier than I ever have. I really wanted to capture the crispness of this. And when I decided on what to do with this, I actually reached out to Jason Haas, who's the owner of Tablas Creek, figuring that they had more experience than anyone else. And with Tablas Creek, with the first 3-4 years they worked with the grapes, they did 2 picks. The first pick was really early, and it created this wine that had a lot of verve, but it didn't have a lot of texture. And then they would do a later pick that was fully textured, but didn't have a lot of acidity and much lift. And based on working with Roussanne and Marsanne and other bigger varieties, they decided to go ahead and do an earlier pick rather than a late pick moving forward. So they do an early pick and they tend to stir the lees, which is going to add more mouthfeel to those wines. And that's not necessarily how everyone else is making this variety, but that's kind of what they figured would set this variety apart from everything else that they do. And therefore, that's what I decided to do as well. So Marianne, do you have a question to ask? Hold on.
Go ahead.
I do. Once you bottle the wine, how long does it have to sit before when you open it, you get a true tasting? A true what it's going to taste, you know what it's going to taste like?
Great question. And the answer is, as the answer to almost everything else I say, is it depends. You know, I've really been surprised at how wide open the new wines that I bottled are already showing immediately. Now I know with, say, my Mourvedre Rosé that we're going to be trying, I know that wine, its best life still lay ahead. And in tasting that wine, I get a sense of where it's going to go. But the Claret, I don't have any experience with. All I know is that it is very representative of what was in the barrel. And that's not always the case, but in this case, it definitely is. It was bright and fresh and aromatic in the barrel. And that's, to me, what it's showing right now as well. But that's a great question. I think it really depends. You know, people talk about bottle shock when it comes to wines. And I think a lot of that has to do with the style the wine is made in, how reductive you are with your winemaking or oxidative with your winemaking. There's a lot of factors that come into play. But in this case, and people ask me like, where is this wine going to go? I would be lying to you if I said I knew, because it's the first time I work with a variety. But even right now, I've kept this wine open 3-4 days in the tasting room without gassing it, and it's still showing beautifully. So I think this wine is very tightly packed and still is going to unravel. But I love the vibrancy of this wine, and it's so different than the other whites that I'm known for, that it's kind of fun. Some people look at this kind of like a Sauv Blanc. It has that kind of texture about it, though to me, very different aromatic expression. But yeah, I wish I can give you an absolute answer, but I can't. So if anyone has, I'm drinking it as well myself right now. So it's been a long day. I'm probably going to drink the whole bottle while we're sitting here, but don't mind me. So if I get a little sloppy as we go on, don't take offense. But yeah, so as I said, it's a wine I'm excited about, and what I'm probably going to do this next year is 2 picks myself. I want to do an early pick. I want to do a little later pick. I'm going to treat them the same, but I want to see what bringing in a little more ripeness does. It's interesting. This vineyard is actually called the Santa Ynez Vineyard, but it is in Happy Canyon. It is the easternmost vineyard that I've ever worked with. If any of you know Happy Canyon, that is kind of home to Bordeaux varieties in our area. And some of the best Sauvignon Blancs in the state of California are coming out of that area, which again, does not surprise me why this might be similar to a Sauvignon Blanc because of the area in which it's grown. And now this is available in 5 or 6 different sites throughout Santa Barbara County. But whether I just got lucky or whether this turns out to be a great site for it, I don't know. I'm excited about working with it again this coming harvest and seeing what I can do with it. So this year, what I might end up doing is 2 ferments. One would be stainless, completely stainless, and the other would be oak. Or I might end up doing 4 ferments, taking the grapes, put some in stainless, some in oak, and trying to kind of comparing and contrasting, because that's really the only way to dial this in, is to get variables and play those variables and see what makes sense over time. Yeah, it's, I would say somebody, you're saying that the mineral of taste. The interesting thing to me is, minerally is a very interesting term, and everyone kind of reacts to it differently. In some cases, it's some sulfur compounds can actually lead to a bit of a minerally quality. And some of it is just playing with your mind, right? If it's acidic, sometimes that comes across as minerally. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear what your impressions are in terms of the minerally aspect of it. And then Rick is asking, maybe I would blend my early and late. Well, that's kind of the fun thing. I might, but I might not. I might end up making 2 different wines, or one of them might go into my Verbiage Blanc, whereas one of them would be kept separate. Interesting. So with Grenache Blanc, I oftentimes get 2 different sites, and one of them is kind of lean and mean like this, and then the other one is richer and more unctuous. And traditionally, I blended the 2 together. The early pick reminds me, and this isn't meant to be a negative, but it kind of reminds me of a Somme wine. Very bright, very acidic. And there's joy in that, but to me, there's got to be a balance. And I think Grenache Blanc just has this beautiful natural richness that I love to include. But it's now is the time to experiment more than ever before, and try not to compete with what I'm doing. So David, I'd be lying to you if I knew what petrichor is, and I should, but I don't actually. My vocabulary, my dad is not going to be happy with me.
It's that smell that you get when rain hits hot pavement, hot rocks after it's been dry.
Okay. That's a cool smell. Well, it was raining today, but there was no hot rain. It was actually hailing here today. So I'll steal the petrichor. That'll be in a future tasting note. Yeah. And those of you who have full bottles, let it open up over a couple of days. See how you feel about it. I'd be curious. Those of you who have small bottles, you know, if you do have some left, let it go from cold to warm as well. I mean, this is one of these white wines that I think will show well both ways. It has enough acidity where if you serve it cold, it's really refreshing. If you have it closer to room temperature, it's still going to be crisp, but it's definitely going to have a little more aromatic kick to it. And I've had a number of people talk about tropical aromas in this, which I thought was pretty interesting. And I tend to, and this is strange, but I always tend to get a bit of like a fennel quality in crisper white wines. And I certainly get that in this as well. But I grew up running through wild fennel as a kid. So everything I smell smells like fennel to me. So I might be the wrong person to comment about that. Yeah, sorry, Chad, no Coravin, unless you have the special Coravin bottle caps. But, you know, the great thing is these screw caps, I mean, they really do a great job holding on to that wine for a couple of days. And even with the Coravin, once that wine's more than a third done, you might as well just drink it because you're fighting Mother Nature in terms of that headspace, for sure.
You should change that to as soon as you open the bottle, you should drink it.
Well, I'm realistic. People have 5 bottles. I don't expect them to drink them all. So, yeah. And I tend to be a pretty darn, I tend to be a pretty darn patient drinker. And Ted and Linda, yeah, I mean, pineapple is one of the comments people have made about this wine, which I've never gotten it personally, but I've had enough people say pineapple that obviously there's got to be that perception out there, which is interesting. Not something you normally find in a white wine. Yeah, but like I said, I'm excited about it. I'm excited to see where it goes. It is, I mean, if it is very, very clear. I see where it gets its color. And when you press the juice is already clear as opposed to being darker like a lot of other varieties are. So. Well, cool. Well, if no other comments, and this is, so when the grapes came in, I talked about sugar levels. So when the grapes came in, the Brix level on this was below 20 Brix. So the way that we calculate out alcohol is it's all based on Brix, which is a density measurement of sugar in wine. And we generally have a factor that we multiply in order to figure out potential alcohol. And normally the highest conversion rate is about 0.6. So if you're bringing wine at about 20 Brix, the most you'd expect it to be would be 12%. At 19.5 Brix, you'd expect it to be, 11.5, 11.75. This turned out to be exactly 12%. So whatever yeast converted this did a very either efficient or inefficient job, but it created more alcohol than I would have normally expected. And to me, that's a good thing. Alcohol in itself is not good or bad, but too little alcohol creates a wine that's too thin. And so the alcohol level actually gave this more body, which I'm excited about.
But it's only 12% alcohol, so it's not overly alcoholic.
No, but even if this was 13%, I don't think it would be alcoholic. I just think that the texture would be different. I mean, this is the pH on this is about 3.1. There's about 7 grams of acid. So it's a crisp wine for sure. In terms of ageability, somebody definitely wants to ask me how this is going to age. And my answer is going to be, I have no friggin' clue. We'll get a sense of that as the year goes on after I've had bottles of it and seen how it develops. But like I said, right now I'm excited about it.
Tastes great for your first year.
Yeah, no, as I said, I'm from the moment it came in and started fermenting really slowly, the aromatics were really cool. And 2020 was a year of me doing things different than what I've done in the past in terms of the varieties, in terms of some methodology. And so I'm just really happy that of the 5 wines that I bottled a month ago, they're all showing really well and all showing very distinctively. So again, could not be happier. Well, no other questions about that. Oh, and just to give you an idea, I talked about the fact that it's not mentioned in any grape crush reports. So we don't know how many tons there are that were crushed. Between Santa Barbara and Paso Robles, there was 71 tons of Pickpool crushed. So that is already listed. So we know it's less than that. And there were 90 tons of other whites. So there's about probably 60 varieties that are listed individually. This falls into a category of it just goes into others. And that's out of 45,000 tons of white grapes that were crushed in the same region in 2020. So again, a very, very, very small bit player, but I do anticipate seeing the number going up. It's not going to become as popular as a lot of other white varieties, but it definitely will pick up speed over the next couple of years, especially because it does well in warm climates. And anytime you can have a white variety that does well in warm climates and still has a good acidity, it's going to be used mainly as a blending component to bring up the acid in other varieties.
What was the calculation you used again? 0.86?
I mean, again, there's no absolute, but generally it's about 0.55 to 0.6 is what people generally use as a conversion factor. Now, what some winemakers do is when those grapes come in, they actually submit them and they'll do a potential alcohol level based on actual glucose and fructose that's in the grapes themselves, whereas mine is just based on a density factor. I'm not actually measuring the actual sugar, it's the density of the liquid relative to water. And that's giving you the approximate sugar content in the wine. And if a wine is 20 bricks, that means there's approximately 200 grams of sugar per liter. Calculating that out, there's about 1 3/4 pounds of sugar per gallon. So wine grapes have a lot of sugar, I must say. All right, well, if we're all ready for that, all done with the first one, and those of you who still have the bottle continue to enjoy it, let's go ahead and move on to the second wine, which is my 2020 Mourvedre Rosé. It's always one of the most anticipated releases that I have. And 2020 was a year that I was actually able to make more of this wine than I was able to make in 2019, which is a good thing. So the question is, how many cases of the Claret did I make? About 125. So about 5 barrels worth. So not a huge amount. So the Mourvedre Rosé, the grapes come from Camp 4 vineyard, planted by Fess Parker and sold by Fess on his deathbed to the Chumash, the local Indian community. It's a 1,200 acre site, about 200 of which is planted to grapes. And of those 200, they've got probably 30 different varieties planted out there. It's a wonderful, Steve, you got the Cinsault Rosé? Well, I guess we're going to be talking different notes then. So I apologize about that. I can go over that one too. That's the problem when I pack everything. You're going to have mistakes, unfortunately. So this comes from Camp 4. I bring the grapes in specifically for rosé. So I bring the grapes in, I foot stomp the grapes. They're on the skins for an hour. Because I brought in so much, I was actually foot stomping for quite a while that day. They sit on skins for about an hour. They go into the press. It's in the press for about an hour, the cycle is. So all its total skin contact is about 2 hours. It goes to a stainless steel tank where it's chilled. And the reason I do that is I want to have all the particles that come in with the skins fall out of solution. So by keeping that tank cold, that precipitates that faster. After 2 days, all of those solids are left in the tank, and I rack off the top of that. I put it into another tank, and this was fermented really slowly at a cooler temperature between 50 and 55 degrees. Ferment took probably about 3.5 weeks. And then after fermentation was done, it was transferred to a smaller tank and to a handful of older French oak barrels. I do that to build up a little bit of texture in the wine, in addition to holding on. I did stainless steel is to hold on to the great aromatics, and then the oak is to give it a little bit more texture. And then again, this was bottled a month ago. So this is still a very, very, very young wine. That skin contact gives it just a little bit of color, but it gives it the texture that I think makes Mourvedre rosés very enticing and different than a lot of other rosés that are out there. And as I said, this is still a really young rosé. I mean, if you're getting Mourvèdre rosés in Bandol, they're not releasing these rosés until the summer or fall. They like to give them more time to really express themselves. And the same is going to be true with this one. I like what it's showing now, but I know based on the 7 or 8 years that I've been working with this fruit and making this, that it definitely, its best life certainly lay ahead in terms of where it's going to go.
It seems like it, since it's got some really good mid palate density, so it's got a lot of material to evolve.
Oh yeah, without a doubt. So the question comes up from Paul: how will it differ from the Cinsault? Well, we have a couple of people trying the Cinsault right now if they want to, but the Cinsault is much lighter in color because the berries are much larger. Even though I foot stomped the Cinsault for 6 hours, if you look at the glass that the Brachis are holding up, it almost looks as clear as the Claret. It's very, very light colored. This is a full bottle of it. Let's see if you might be able to see. It's kind of difficult in this light. I apologize, but it is incredibly light colored. The Cinsault aromatics are totally different. Somebody mentioned bubblegum, and I do get a sense of bubblegum with the Cinsault, but I tend to get more of like peach, like fresh peaches, where I don't get that personally in the Mourvèdre as well. And the Cinsault, in the 2020 version of the Cinsault, definitely has a creaminess on the finish. It was in oak as well as stainless steel, but whereas the Mourvèdre has more mouthfeel and interesting texture, the Cinsault again has a creaminess to the finish, which is really, really interesting. The Cinsault is also about a point lower in alcohol. So that's going to change the body of that wine as well. And it is a similar use of stainless and older French oak on both of the wines. I like that for both of the rosés. I don't try to make the exact same, I don't do the exact same methodology, but it's pretty darn similar between the two. And I think the Cinsault, you know, it was also bottled a month ago. I've been pouring that in the tasting room, and I'm really, after that wine has had a little bit to get through, and I don't want to say bottle shock, but I think it is really starting to show some of this very similar characters that it did in last year's, but it's taken a little bit longer for it to kind of come through. So what about the oak versus the Claret? So the Claret, like I said, was fully fermented in oak to try to build more mouthfeel, whereas my rosés are fermented in stainless to hold on to the aromatics. So that's one of the big differences. And then in terms of the oak usage, the Claret saw more oak as a percentage of its aging than the rosé. The rosés are mainly stainless.
Are those the only two rosés that you do, or do you do a Grenache rosé also, or?
I used to do a Grenache rosé. That was kind of the main variety I like to work with, but I found over time that my Grenache rosés kind of sang a single note. I think Grenache to me is just a little more simple. Tends to be watermelon, strawberry, and not a lot else. And I think that Mourvèdre naturally brings this earthiness to the table that separates. So it's not a better or worse. It's just for my what I like. It seems to work better. I don't think I'm going to end up doing a third rosé, but I guess I'm never going to say never. I'm already doing 2 esoteric rosés, so I'm sure maybe I'll do a third one. In fact, I think I've had somebody on one of my calls say, "Why don't you just do rosés? Like just do 8 of them, and we'd be happy." So I will say, people ask me all the time, "What's the most difficult wine to make?" And rosés are pretty tough because they're pretty naked. There's not a lot of moving pieces between grape and finished wine, right? I'm not putting it in oak. I'm not keeping it for a year, 2 years, 3 years. This is done pretty quickly and gets onto the marketplace pretty quickly. It has to show itself immediately. And that's a big difference between a lot of the other wines that I do. And so from a minimalist standpoint, I love making these. I wouldn't if they didn't show well, but I love making them because I think they're very expressive and unique.
I'm not sure the folks in Bandol would call Mourvèdre rosé esoteric.
They would just call it rosé, but
well, they do some.
but then
But
again,
they use other grapes in the blend. Yeah.
sure, but I mean, I think they can use up to 85% more veteran. I think a lot of them probably
Right.
use like, I think it has to be over 50 and
Yep.
up to 85. So I think compared to a lot of what comes out in Provence, they might call their wines a little esoteric based on the flavor profile compared to a lot of else that comes out in. It just could be my guess, but yeah. So somebody asked, how do I not hurt my feet when I foot stomp? I never said I didn't hurt my feet, but you know, they get pretty callous pretty quickly. It always sounds strange when I tell people I foot stomp my grapes. They're always kind of curious about it, but the first time you stomp the grapes, you definitely feel those stems, but after that, you really get used to them. So they don't hurt my feet anymore, unless I step directly on like an edge, and then I get cut up. But other than that, that rarely happens.
This one, of the rosé, but not all of them. He washes his feet.
Who said I wash I don't wash my feet. I'm never going to admit whether I do or not, but I always ask the question, you know, when people say, do you wash your feet? I always ask, do you want me to tell you what comes in with the grapes? You're not worried about the cleanliness of my feet. If you imagine these grapes are picked late at night, early in the morning, whatever's in that vineyard is coming in with these grapes. And I don't sort my fruit. So most of the time, if you go to a winery, the first thing that's going to happen is the clusters are going to go down a big conveyor belt and they're going to pull out things that don't belong. And then oftentimes they're going to go from that into a destemmer, and then only those perfect berries are going to be left. Everything else is going to be tossed out. I don't do anything like that. The grapes come in. I'm in the vineyard the day before the grapes are picked. I have a good idea of what kind of is going on, and they know what to pick and what to try not to pick. But I mean, you know, you end up with leaves, you end up with all kinds of other things in with the grapes. And there's a lot of winemakers that they hate seeing stuff like that because they feel it's going to detract from the purity of the wine. And the question I always ask winemakers is, what percentage of those things are actually going to make a wine worse? And no one can answer that question because there's no way to know. I think I've mentioned this on other Zooms, but you know, winemakers talk about trying to capture their terroir of the grapes that they get, try to capture the sense of place. Well, when you take clusters and you kick out the ones that aren't perfect, and then you take the grapes and you kick out the ones that aren't perfect, is that really representative of what you're given, or are you manipulating it to the perfect nature of what you're trying to achieve? And we can have philosophical differences all night about this. So I'm not saying one's right, one's wrong, but I think it does raise the question of, you know, yes, David said MOG. So MOG is materials other than grapes that come in with the grapes. You know, what percentage of that detracts from the purity of the wine? And again, we can have philosophical discussions all night long. I don't think there's a right answer to that.
I was going to make a joke about there being toe jam in the flavor profile.
Yeah, you know, I was going to call a red Toe Jam Red, but I figured that probably wasn't a good marketing campaign. So, but I've joked about this in the past. Yeah, I've got this whole foot fetish group that seems to really like my wine. So I'm just kind of going with it at this point. You know, you have to pivot and leverage. And just kidding. Kind of. Yeah, no, I'm just kidding. Yeah, I see some of you not laughing. Please don't take me seriously. Please don't take me seriously. So any question? So what's the oldest Pinot Noir you think is still on the upswing? That's a great question. I think my 16 Rosé is drinking fantastically right now. Before 2016, I used to age most of my Rosés in oak. It would be fermented in stainless and then aged in oak and then bottled. And I'm finding that the older Rosés, though still interesting, they're tending to take on a more creamy quality from that oak. Whereas the newer ones that I've done that were mainly stainless are not taking on that quality. So it's a preference more than anything else. But I've had Rosés, I've had my 11, I've had my 12. They're not shot. They still have life ahead of them. I don't think my Rosés, I'd love to say my Rosés are going to last as long as Tempier, but I'm not cocky enough to say that. But I do think my Rosés certainly do improve to the point where they are enjoyable 3, 4, 5 years out. As long as they're not oxidizing, they're going to change. They're not going to be as intense aromatically, and texturally they're going to change. But just like a red wine, they're going to continue to evolve. Any other questions about the rosé? So as I said, I've got the 2 rosés. I have this rosé and my Cinsault rosé. So I think the next Zoom will probably include my Cinsault rosé, but I'll make sure to send the Braccis the Mourvedre rosé so that we're even. All right, well then let's move on to the first of the reds. So the first of the reds is my 2017 Carignan. So this is the second release of this variety for me. And it's a variety that I worked with when I was at Fess Parker. It would be put into big blends. It was never kept on its own. I was fortunate to try some old Mendocino Carignans, some Carignans out of Spain, and I just kind of fell in love with the variety. I think it makes a very interesting variety. I've chosen to pick my Carignan earlier rather than later to kind of show off the earthier components that I think make this a distinct variety. Those of you who have some of you have already heard this Carignan, originally a Spanish variety, was planted in a region called Aragon in Spain. During the reign of Aragon, it was taken from Spain into France and into Italy, where it's grown. And it's been grown throughout the Mediterranean since. It is it's a bit player in the Rhone, but it's been very popular in Languedoc, and it's actually made a lot of jug wines. So the French have actually pushed growers to plant less Carignan. It's got a bit of a notorious past. When phylloxera almost wiped out the French wine industry, this was heavily planted in Algeria and other French provinces, and it was shipped into France as a French wine, even though it wasn't a French wine. Kind of fell under the umbrella. And then in this country, one of its nicknames has been Dago Red. And not to be derogatory, but at the turn of the century, when home winemakers on the East Coast wanted grapes to make home wine with, Carignan was a variety that held its shape and didn't get moldy growing cross country. So a lot of early immigrant jug wines were made with this variety. And the majority of Carignan in this country is still planted in the Central Valley. Now, the variety's been in this country for 150 years. If any of you are Zin fans, if you pull out a Ridge Lytton Springs Zin, you're going to find it's 5 to 10% Carignan. So it's been part of mixed blocks in Mendocino and Sonoma County, literally since the 1860s, 1870s. But it really has not had much of a presence as a standalone variety. That's changing a little bit. There are winemakers now, much hipper than me, that are working with a variety that are going to kind of bring it to a little bit more of notoriety. But to me, it's a challenging variety because if you pick it ripe, it becomes a generic red wine. It loses all of its unique characteristics. It has some cherry fruit, but not much else. So to me, picking it earlier, it's going to exhibit more of that earthy quality that I think makes it really, really interesting. So yeah, so people are saying smoky, so pine needles. So the stems, this is also foot stomp. So the stems are going to be pretty noticeable in this wine. I've had people compare this to Pinot Noir in some ways. And I think that's probably more texture than anything else. It's only about 12% alcohol. But this is also a wine that I've been amazed how it's changed in bottle, opening it up over a couple of day period. Even though it's a 17, I'm just releasing this. This is still a really young wine. But I also learned, this is the second time I've made this. In 2016, I only kept it in oak for 10 months. I released it pretty quickly. And I will tell you that my 16, if any of you have that, is drinking absolutely gorgeously now. It needed more time to express itself. So by holding this back a little bit, I think I'm catching it at a much better point where it's really already expressing itself well, but still has plenty of upside potential. Well, Michael, I'll be curious to hear how those, though Two Shepherds makes his wine in a very different way than I do, for sure. So even though we're comparing the same grape, we're comparing very different methodologies. And I like what he does. But
I've
yeah,
always,
a lot
I've
of your
always wondered, I'm sorry, I've always wondered what that flavor note was in the Lytton Springs Zin, and it's just like, oh, duh, yeah. Thank you so much for that. I've always wondered.
Well, Lytton Springs is probably 5 different varieties that are in that, right? So if you look on the back label, and Ridge is great about that, right? They list everything. And I'm pretty sure, I mean, in some cases they're going to pick the varieties separately, but in some cases they can't because they can't really tell, right? So, but that normally has a little more Vedra in it, which they're going to call Mataro because Ridge is Ridge. It may have Petit Syrah. Petit's always been blended with Zinfandel. I shouldn't say always. Historically, it's been blended because it's given Zinfandel more color. And so it's not surprising. There might be some Polarizin in there, which is one of the parents of Syrah. I'm sorry, one of the parents of Petit Syrah. There is a couple of acres of Polarizin in California. So for all I know, it can be in that vineyard. But yeah, you're going to find like 4 to 6 different varieties in Lytton Springs and in a lot of those old Zins up there because they're just picked as a block. I think what happened was it was probably planted to 1 or 2 varieties, and over time when those varieties died out, they just planted to whatever they had. And so that's how these mixed blocks came about. So somebody's asking about crunchy. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting term, Chad. And to me, that would imply texture more than anything else. And to me, when I hear crunchy in a red wine, to me that I'm going to guess it's a combination of like bitter compounds and acid that would be leading to that feeling. I like that term. It emotes certain things, but it's not definable. You know, it's kind of like on one of these tastings, you know, somebody used the term funky, right? And funky is kind of that same thing. It leads to whatever you want it to lead to. So
yeah, crunchy for me has always been that the fruit isn't quite, you know, it's not quite perfect grocery store ripe, right? It's still got a little bit more al dente to it, and so it's a brighter, and that's where the acidity thing comes in, right? Because it's a brighter flavor. It's not quite as soft and supple and uber ripe.
All right, David. So from now on, you are going to be known as the al dente fruit guy. I like it. I've never heard that term before, but I think it works. Yeah, I mean, to me, crunchy would remind me of, say, a lot of Italian table wines. And I would guess that in the same manner of what David is saying. It's not that smooth polished. It's got some rough edges around it. It's that old school vinyl, right? It's got the scratches that make it interesting. Yeah, I'm loving reading the descriptors. So olive, a lot of non-fruit elements, which I tell people all day long, I love non-fruit elements in wine. It's easy to make really fruity wines. It's definitely more challenging to make wines that have other things going on. And that's where the stems to me come into play. Winemakers, I get asked all the time, you know, why do I include stems in my wine? And to me, winemakers will say they don't want to include any stems because they feel it detracts from the purity of the fruit. And I would agree with them, but I don't think that's a negative. To me, it's a positive in that it kind of tones down the fruit and adds other things to it. But that's personal preference. As with everything in wine, everything, you know, it all comes down to your perception of it. So it's a Burgundian Rhone variety. Matt, I'll take that. I'll use that. I'll take that to the bank. I think the same could be true with Cinsault. I think both those varieties kind of work in that same manner. They're lighter. They're kind of fresher. They certainly work in blends, but boy, on their own, they're just wonderful. But you know, a lot of people are drawn to darker, richer red wines in general. I'm not saying you guys at all, but I'm just saying in general, I think there's a bias towards that. So these types of wines, you're not going to see a lot of because they're definitely on the outskirts. They're not your mainstream. That's why people pick this variety later to make a darker, richer red wine. So, but yeah, like I said, I'm excited about this. And if any of you have any left over, definitely, you know, have it on day 2. I think it's going to become even more interesting as it opens up. All right, well, if we're done with that, now we're gonna, as Monty Python, now we're gonna do something completely different. So now we're gonna go from this light wine to a bit of a heavy hitter. So the next one is my 2013 Grenache from a vineyard called Watch Hill. Watch Hill has a kind of a special place in my heart. So the first year I made wine was 2006, and I was searching for fruit, and I got a call from the vineyard manager in early November saying, "Hey, we still have this Grenache available. Would you be interested in it?" The first thing I did was I asked a guy named Michael Segway, who has a label called Cayena. Michael is, he touts himself as the king of Grenache. We're not going to go into whether he is or not, but that's what he touts himself as. I wanted to give him kind of first right of refusal. And he had said, "No, I'm good. Why don't you go ahead and bring it in?" And so I did. And once it started fermenting, I just knew it was a very special block. So this vineyard is planted in Los Alamos, about 10 miles from where I'm sitting right now. There's only 25 rows of Grenache in this vineyard. Most of it is planted to Syrah. And in fact, Andrew Murray of Andrew Murray Vineyards makes us a pretty well-known Syrah from this site. It shares some of the climatic similarities to Santa Maria Valley. It's not quite up in that valley, but it definitely has cool nights and warm days. To me, it produces a Grenache that is as vibrant as a warm climate Grenache, but still has plenty of backbone. I find California Grenaches oftentimes go strawberry candy. This definitely is a little darker profile than that. Color-wise, it's not really dark. It's not as dark as my Larner, which is a cooler site, but it has very, very bright, exuberant aromatics. But this thing still has lots of texture. In most cases, people want to pair Grenache with pork, and I think this goes great with pork. But, and of course, those vegans out there, I would say it goes great with mushrooms. How's that? But this also would go great with red meat, which is kind of rare for a Grenache. And what I like about this as well is, to me, it still holds, it retains the typicity of the variety without losing it, even though it's a large-scaled Grenache. There's a lot of Grenaches out in the marketplace that if you smell them, it's impossible to tell what variety they are. And I don't think that happens with this. I think it's still holding on to that. So somebody's saying dark cherry meets maraschino cherry. I could definitely see that. I get, cherry or like a very dark raspberry on this. Some people will definitely get a chocolatey quality to it, like almost like a cherry chocolate liqueur. So this was 34 months in older oak. It was foot stomped, put into the barrels, never taken out of the barrels during those 34 months. So what that's going to do is it's going to keep the wine really tightly wound so that when it gets in the bottle, that's when it's going to start its slow evolutionary process. This wine was bottled in early 2017. So it's been in bottle now for 4 years. And to me, it's got still has a very, very long life ahead of it. It definitely is on the large scale, especially after having that Carignan. It might be it's going to hit you much, much differently than that Carignan is. That alcohol level is higher. And with Grenache, you kind of have to play that devil's game in that Grenache is a variety that kind of like Zinfandel. Yes, back in the day, perhaps you had a 12% Zinfandel that tasted like a Zinfandel. But nowadays, when you have a lower alcohol Zinfandel, it really doesn't show the variety, the varietal character, the typicity of it. Grenache is the same way. Grenache skins are very bitter and very tannic. And if you pick this grape early, you end up with a wine that has this bitter quality to it without showing off the beautiful aromatics that this variety is known for. So again, it is a 2013, but this wine still has a very, very, very long life ahead of it. My 2014s are actually a little more dialed back than my 13s. I was opening them up the other day, and they're big and bold, but 14 was a different vintage. This 13 was the first of the 3 drought years that we had in a row. And all of my grapes in 2013 came in about a month earlier than I ever would have picked them before. This vineyard, in fact, I'll never forget 2013, early September, I walked into the vineyard and pretty much everyone had picked at this site by September 15th, except for me and Andrew Murray. And I gave Andrew a call. In fact, the gate was locked. I had to call them. I had to hop a fence to sample my grapes. And I gave Andrew a call. I'm like, what do we know that other people don't, or did we screw up? And I tasted the grapes. And the thing about Grenache, as I said, they have very bitter tannic skins. You have to wait for those skins to start softening, or you end up with a really backwards wine. The sugar level had gone way up because of the heat that we had, and because the crop level was not large, but the grapes weren't ready physiologically. So I ended up waiting about 3 weeks after that. But because the crop level was big enough, the sugar level really didn't go up much, but the physiological development of the grapes changed radically. And I'm really, really happy. I'm happy with where this wine is now. I've been happy since this wine is released, and I'm excited to see where it goes as well. And I apologize. I'm still enjoying the claret, so I can't keep up with all of you. The great thing is you guys are all at home. You don't have to go anywhere. I have about 3 hours of work after I'm done here, and then I got to drive home after that. So,
But I don't blame you for going back to the claret. It's a good wine.
It is very nice.
well, I'm cannonballing that with the coffee, so I'll be fine. So how would I compare this to the Syrah? Well, I don't do a Syrah from this site. And the flavor profile of Grenache and Syrah, I don't think should ever be the same. And that's one of the challenges, I think, with, the Larner Grenache. So my Larner Grenache is, it's a cooler climate site. It definitely shows more darker fruit. So whereas this one is going to show raspberry and cherry, that's going to show dark cherry. Aromatically, it's not as exuberant, but it's a beautiful, I love that Grenache, but they're very, very different based on site. Yeah, and Watch Hill, so I did a 14, I think I did a 15, and then I stopped working with this vineyard. I love the site. They got greedy and just started ramping up the price of their fruit. And at some point, I need to justify the wines that I produce. And be able to allow people to afford my wines. And if I continue to work with fruit that's getting more and more expensive, I got to continue to raise my prices, and I don't want to do that. So I'm not the Grenache King by the Rhone Rangers, but there was 2 Grenache events done in LA called Grenache Wars, and there were about a dozen winemakers at each of them. And both times I was named the winner. And surprisingly, the guy who put the event on, he put something on Facebook, and he said, announcing, Larry Schaefer, hashtag Grenache King. Kind of didn't like that. So I had to change it to King of Grenache. So, but it's, to me, Grenache, I love working with Grenache. I love the purity of the fruit. I find Grenache to be overt beauty. A well-made Grenache is just so pretty. I don't understand how people, I know David was saying I have to win him over. Grenache is a variety. I mean, if all it is strawberry candy, it's not interesting to me, but it definitely has a lot more going on with it. And probably the best wine I've ever had in the world was a Grenache.
Larry, this wine did. I don't know if you saw in the comments. This wine, you won me over.
Awesome. Well, I'm thankful of that. But it like I said, it's a showy Grenache. It definitely holds on to what you expect in a Grenache, but is big and bold for sure. So only Larner for Grenache moving forward? No, Michael, I started getting Grenache from a site in the Santa Rita Hills called the Spear Vineyard, which is just into the Santa Rita Hills. Santa Rita Hills is interesting because everyone feels that it's a really cold area, but not all of it is really cold. And this site that Spear, that I get it from, allows it to get fully ripe at about 14% alcohol. But it is definitely on the lighter raspberry and very floral aspect. So I do have my 2018 Spear Grenache on the website, and it's kind of the yin to the yang of this Grenache. I like to say that, like, this Grenache, putting in football terms, this Watch Hill is a linebacker. The Spear is more a wide receiver. So they're just different takes on the variety. But the Spear is definitely a site I'm excited about working with. And in fact, my 2018, what I did is I bottled 3 barrels of it after 16 months, I still have 4 barrels in barrel because I really wanted to see what bottle age versus barrel age does. And I'll be, hopefully next week, I'll be tasting through those barrels and bring a bottle with me to kind of compare and contrast. Well, thank you, Relics. I will see you up here soon for sure. So, all right. So if no other questions about the Grenache, let's go ahead and move towards the last one, the Petite Syrah. So this is, be it a good or bad thing, the last Petite Syrah that I did. It is a variety that I like. I just have found other varieties I like more. And this comes from a site called the La Presa Vineyard, which was a one-time purchase for me of fruit. This vineyard's in Santa Ynez, and this has changed as much. So the alcohol level on the new site, like I said, on the Grenache, that Spirit Grenache is about 14%, so it definitely is lighter. So this Petite Syrah, when I picked the grapes, they were picked ripe. They were picked at about 25 and a half bricks, but they still retained about 7 grams of acidity, and the pH was about 3.4. And that kind of scared me as a winemaker because Petite Syrah is known for being very tannic. That acid is going to accentuate that tannin even more. And this was a wine that when I picked it and for its first year of life, I really wasn't very happy with it. I used to get from Fess Parker from the Rodney's Vineyard, and I really like that Petite, but they hold on to all of that themselves now. They don't sell that to anyone else. And Petite is a really interesting variety. It is known as this like big tannic bold variety, but it's actually a bit wimpy in the sense that it is a late ripening variety. It has very, very tight clusters. Any moisture in October or November is going to lead to bunch rot. Most red varieties have relatively loose clusters where water can escape, wind can blow it away. Petite Syrah does not. So it's not uncommon for you have to pick Petite Syrah to avoid that mold. But you don't want to pick Petite Syrah early because it is so tannic. So it's this kind of balancing game. What Petite went into Cuvée Loco? The only time I never had Petite in Cuvée Loco. So Cuvée Loco is all Larner fruit. It's Syrah, Grenache, and Mourvèdre. They don't have Petite at Larner. I did have a wine called Verbiage Rouge, another red blend, but actually the precursor to that, Cuvée Christie, had Petite in it 1 year and 1 year only, because I do a wine called The Climb. I used to do it, which is a Syrah Petite Syrah blend. And that was a wine that was done kind of an homage to a winery named Schaefer, spelled differently than mine. And I couldn't call my name Schaefer anyway, because Doug would have sued me. But they have a wine called Relentless, and it's a Syrah Petite Syrah blend. And I love that. So I used to make this wine. In 2009, I was going to put that together and decided not to do the blend because it wasn't unique enough. It didn't separate itself. So the Petite ended up going into Cuvée Christie instead. So this Petite, as I said, for the first year and a half, I really wasn't happy with it. The longer it stayed in oak, the more it developed, the more it kind of integrated, the more the acid is noticeable, but it's not sticking out like a sore thumb. This wine has really developed nicely. And I really dig where this wine is at right now. Almost makes me want to do it again, but I'm not there yet. So, but I like where it's at. Yeah, Petite Syrah from Thompson. If my last name was Jaffers, I probably could, but no, Petite, actually, they do have Petite available. And if I were to do, in fact, I reached out to them last year. If I were to do a Petite again, it would definitely come from that vineyard. Again, that fruit is getting very expensive, and that would be something that I would have to lay down for a long time. And I'm just not sure that's something I want to do right now. But I learned a long time ago in life, never say never. So I'm not going to rule that out as a possibility, but not on my list of must-haves, at least for 2021 right now.
So Larry, you're releasing Mourvèdre and Grenache with 7 or 8 years of aging on it, and you're worried about laying down Petite Syrah?
Well, at some point you have to think of the math behind this. So I'm not worried about laying it down in terms of how it's going to perform. I'm worried about having to release it before it's going to perform well monetarily, and that's just not what I generally do with my wines.
Yep.
I want to hold them where they're drinking well, but still showing well, and still have an upside potential. But you know, it's fun. So in 2020, more than half the grapes I picked have already been bottled. So I'm definitely kind of changing some of what I do to get things to market faster. So Petite can be a 20 to 30 year wine. I agree with the billets. In fact, my dad gifted me a couple of Turley Hain Vineyard Petite Syrahs about 15 years ago. He said, I'm not going to be alive when these are ready to drink. I thought that was kind of sick, but I thanked him anyway and bought him some 15-year-old Petites to replace the ones he gave me so that he could at least enjoy them. I always say I never want to make wine that you have to knowingly lay down that long. Not that my wines can't last that long, but I understand the concept, and obviously there's a lot of Bordeaux, there's Burgundy that really you don't want to drink before then. But in some cases you can't drink them before then. They're difficult to drink. I don't want to do that. I want to produce wines that are drinkable, but still have upside potential. And Petite is one of those varieties that's really tricky, because if it's undrinkable young and you need to hold it that long, it's just hard as nails. And I just prefer not to make that style of wine. But, you know, listen, if you want to invest in a couple of tons and pay for the wines in advance, and I'll deliver them to you in 30 years, that sounds good. I could try. So Kevin is saying, okay, well, Kevin, I'll send you a message there about the backstory. Many of you have already heard my backstory. You don't want to hear the backstory again. But I mean, to put it briefly, I've been making wine about 20 years. This is not what I started out doing. I don't come at this through the eyes of a winemaker. I really come out winemaking through the eyes of a consumer, first and foremost. I kind of lead by education. My favorite winery in this country is probably Tablas Creek, because that's exactly what they do. They try to educate as best as possible, because to me, that's an important part of winemaking. It is what's inside the bottle, but it's how did it get here? And to me, another important thing is typicity. And that's a term that's kind of been lost in this country. But if I make a Grenache, I want it to show like a Grenache. If I make a Syrah, I want it to show like a Syrah. I don't want my Grenaches to be Syrah-like, so to speak. So that's been one of the fun things as I've worked with varieties like Cinsault and Carignan. I've had a chance to try versions from other countries. I've had a chance to try older versions, and there's definitely some common lineage to what I do. And that's been, it's been fun to see that. There was in like Cinsault, for instance, there was in Hospice du Rhône a couple of years ago, there was a seminar of 7 South African Cinsault producers, and I had a chance to try those wines, and my wines are not the same as theirs, but I can see a commonality with what I'm doing, which was kind of cool to see. So. Well, any questions about any of these wines? So I do have, just so you know, I am recording this. So if anyone would like a recording of this, they certainly can reach out to me. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to be doing this whole thing again next week for those people who did not get their wines. So you are more than happy to reach out to me if you'd like. Just as I did last time, I did put together a 6-pack of these wines that are currently on the website. It's under the white section. It says Zoom 6-pack. If you use the code Zoom27, and it's only going to be for tonight, just like I did last time. So Zoom27, it'll give you a pretty big discount on these wines. So it's a 6-pack. It's 2 of the Carignan and then 1 each of all the other wines that are part of this 6-pack. And then anyone who has any questions, certainly feel free to reach out, after the fact. Everyone knows how to get a hold of me. Steve has a question. Other than when are you going to get your Mourvèdre Rosé? And I do apologize. Yes.
No. It's completely off topic. How's the Gewürztraminer coming?
It's awesome. Really,
don't tempt us like that.
Yeah, but it's a very different beast. That is going to be included. The next Zoom I do is going to have that wine. So I do a dry Gewürztraminer, and I have not done that wine in 7 years. And the reason I've not is the vineyard that I worked with, they grafted it to something else. And so it definitely is not a Rhone variety, as those of you who may know about Gewürztraminer. but it's a variety that I really love. And so I decided this year to do it again. I picked it from a vineyard called the Carrari Vineyard, which is owned by Lucas Newellen. It's about a 40-year-old vineyard. And working with them, I didn't have the choice of when to pick the grapes. I was given the grapes by them when they picked their grapes, which is fine. Megan is a very good winemaker. And I had sampled the grapes about 2 days before. So the grapes came in, and I fermented this drier than I've ever fermented an outlier. So it only has about 0.1% residual, but it's about 13.8, 13.9 alcohol. So it's the highest alcohol level I've had. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, because when it comes to body with Gewürztraminers, either the residual sugar is going to give it body or alcohol is going to give it body. And in this case, the alcohol is giving it this great richness, but it was stainless steel fermented, stainless steel aged, very, very aromatic. And what's interesting, when I used to release my Gewürztraminers, it would be a challenge to sell them. A, because people can't pronounce Gewürztraminer, which is understandable. There's a lot of spitting that goes on when people try to pronounce that. The other thing is Gewürztraminer tends to be very, very aggressive aromatically. If you look at Riesling versus Gewürztraminer, Riesling is, it's got some interesting aromatics. Gewürztraminer literally hits you over the head. Very floral. And this Gewürztraminer it's exciting. I'm excited about it. So yeah, that'll be shared on the next one, as well as I did my first carbonic wine. I call it Nouveau Cinsault. And that'll be featured in one of my upcoming ones as well. Somebody asked about so I am making Pinot Noir for the first time from a vineyard called Kessler Hock, which is in Santa Rita Hills, right next to Clos Pepe. I have 3 different clones that are currently resting in older oak, all 100% foot stomp. So I'm going to make Pinot the way I make my wines. So they're definitely going to be a little different than what's out there, but I'm really excited about that. And I'm also doing my first variety labeled Cabernet Franc. And so that's going to be exciting. And what I'm probably going to do is, and so chances are the label, it's going to be this, I'm going to bottle my Pinot in a regular bottle. I'm not going to bottle it in a burgundy shaped bottle. So I'm going to kind of buck the trend there. But it's exciting. I'm really excited about it. So, and Bracci's, I only have about 2 cases of that 14. So that's my library. That's all I have to enjoy that wine. But the next time you guys are up, I'll open up an 11 or 12 for you. So I still have some of my older ones. So no Graziano, no Ted. No, there are a lot of people working with Graziano in this area. We call it Mourvedre, but I don't know if you know the whole story. There was a big mistake. Graziano so Monastrell in Italian is very close to Graziano. And there was a whole bunch of vineyards that supposedly received Monastrell that actually turned out to be Graziano. So you're seeing a lot of people in our area producing Graziano, because what else are they going to do with it? But no, it's far enough away from where I want it to be. So somebody's asking about the Claret Blanche. So it is available as part of that 6-pack. It's not available on the site as an individual wine, but later on tonight, I will certainly go ahead and add that. And make
Larry,
sure.
where do I find the 6-pack on your site? I'm on your site right now.
It's under whites.
Oh, it's under whites.
Yeah, it's under whites. Yeah, it's under whites on the bottom of the whites. Just zoom 6-pack. So.
Okay.
Well,
Great.
cool. Well, listen, I want to thank all of you very much. I really do appreciate, David, I got your message, so your email, thank you. But I want to appreciate all of you coming on board. This is something I definitely plan on doing, again, probably once every 6 weeks or so. I don't want to overwhelm you guys, but I really, really do appreciate the support. And I hope if you guys have any questions, you will reach out to me for sure. And if you want to see me do anything different than what I'm doing in these, reach out to me. I generally don't do a lot of videos. I don't do a lot of during my Zooms. I know there are some Zooms that you can go to. They have all kinds of maps up with the vineyards and stuff. If you'd like to see stuff like that, I certainly can add that. Just let me know.
Thanks so much.
And those of you who have ordered wines, so the rosés, I started shipping out the rosés already. So you're going to be receiving your rosé order soon, as well as all the other stuff over the last 6 weeks as I'm catching up. All right, guys, thank you very much. Have a great evening. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Larry.